Mhm. Hello, everyone who's just arriving. We're going to do an introduction in just a minute. Welcome everyone who's just arriving. Like I just said, we're going to do an introduction in just a minute. We're going to let a couple more people filter in. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Inside the Workspace. This is a lecture series, the first of 3 lectures that we'll be giving this fall. These lectures and conversations are moderated by Rial Christian. I'm assuming that a lot of people who are participating today are already familiar with Dieu Donné, but if you're not, we are a leading nonprofit cultural institution dedicated to serving established and emerging artists through the collaborative creation of contemporary art using the process of hand paper making. And to give you a little bit of information about this series, which is called Inside the Workspace, in celebration of the 30th anniversary of Dieu Donné Workspace Program, we're pleased to present Inside the Workspace, a virtual conversation series featuring artists who have participated in the residency over the years. Since its inception, the Workspace program has attracted a collection of artists who resist easy categorization. Thematically, stylistically, and representationally different, their individual practices reveal the broad range of possibilities inherent in hand paper making. Throughout this conversation series, we will look back on the history of the residency and its artists while reflecting on the theme of collaboration in a socially distant world. So here with us today, we have Nancy Cohen and Mina Takahashi. To give you a little bit of information on Nancy Cohen, Jersey-based artist, Nancy Cohen's work examines resiliency in relation to the environment and the human body. Recent exhibitions include a solo show at Catherine Markle Fine Arts and group exhibitions at Akala Griffin, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, Biobat, Dorsky Gallery, and the Montclair Museum. In 2021, she will have a residency at Women's Studio Workshop and a solo exhibition of large-scale paperworks at the Visual Arts Center of New Jersey. Mina Takahashi is editor of Hand Papermaking Magazine, a nonprofit biannual publication dedicated to advancing traditional and contemporary ideas in the art of hand papermaking. Previously, she was the executive director of Dieu Donné from 1990 to 2004. She now lives in upstate New York. And Rial Christian, our moderator today, is a writer and curator based in Queens, New York. Her work has appeared in Art in America, Art Papers, Art in Print, The Brooklyn Rail, and Bomb Magazine. She has contributed to artist texts, to recent and forthcoming catalogs with the CUE Art Foundation, Performa, and Leibsdorf Gallery, Hunter College. She is a curatorial fellow at Hunter College Art Galleries and an MA candidate in art history at Hunter College. So we're really happy to have all 3 of these amazing people here with us today to talk about the Workspace program and to hear a little bit about Nancy's process collaborating in the Dieu Donné studios. So this talk will be about 45 minutes long, and the last 15 minutes will be dedicated to Q&A. We ask that you funnel all of your questions into the Q&A chat. Some of your questions, if it works well, I can answer in the moment. Other questions I will raise to the group at the end of the discussion. So if I'm not answering your question right away, know that it will be answered at the end of the talk. So Rial, I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you, Willa. And thank you for coordinating this discussion. And thank you, Nancy and Mina, for being here. So let's just get started. So I wanted to start with these two images side by side. Mina, this is you in 2007, working in the studio at Dieu Donné, shortly after your tenure as executive director. And Nancy, this was taken, I believe, in fall or winter of last year. So around this time last year, a very different time. And I had hoped to find images of you two together because I know that you met during Nancy's residency in 1992 at Dieu Donné when they were located at Crosby Street. But I do like how these photographs sort of mirror each other at slightly different moments and points in the paper-making process. These are a few images from the Crosby Street studio, which is where the Workspace program started in 1990. And Mina, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about how the residency program began and what the selection process was like.
Sure. So this photo is probably these photos are probably from the mid 80s, but it didn't change that much until we moved out of 3 Crosby Street. So we were on the 5th floor with a very, very ancient, slow elevator that sometimes did not work. But when Nancy was in the Workspace program in '92, she had her residency in this space. But the Workspace Residency started in 1990. And well, let me just go back a little bit. So Dieu Donné Paper Mill was founded in 1976. And it was during a time where there was a lot of excitement around engaging with more craft-based media in contemporary art. And so artists were experimenting in textile design and clay and book arts, bookbinding, and of course printmaking. That was a big printmaking renaissance. And with that came paper making. And Sue and Paul were both graduates of University of Wisconsin-Madison program with Walter Hamady. And Sue founded the organization in '76 and really had a whole array of artists who would come through and work with paper and pulp in the creation of their artwork. And there was also a lot of support, gallery support at that time, that would bring artists into the space to make editioned work or pulp paintings, and really kind of the first experimentation with paper and pulp in contemporary art making. By the late 80s, you could see that it kind of went out of style a little bit, and kind of was more sort of a hard-edged sensibility that came into contemporary art. And there was a lot less of that activity in the studio. There was still a lot of sheet formation, making paper for artists and conservators and museums and such. But the number of artists who are really, really experimenting in the medium kind of slowed down. And that's when Sue decided it's time to seek out not-for-profit status to really continue that kind of work. And with that came the formation of the Workspace program. And at the beginning, it was conceived as a way to bring artists who were both emerging and also established, so that it was a way to serve artists, but also a way to serve the medium. We had this idea that that emerging artists would really kind of wildly experiment, and that maybe more mid-career artists, we would actually, as viewers, you would sort of see, if you're familiar with the artist's work, you'd sort of see how they would translate their work in paper. So in that sense, it would advance the art itself or the medium itself. Anyhow, by the mid-90s, it was really actually at the prompting of our funders, and at that time it was essentially New York State Council on the Arts who said, you know, we really need to, a lot of the artist grants, like the NEA individual artist grants, they were all kind of, the whole NEA was getting decimated. And we really need to get artists, we need to get artist support. And through workspaces and residencies, it seemed like what they would want to support. So then we switched it up and established it as a emerging artist program. And many years later, we were able to establish the lab grant program, which was for more mid-career artists. But that was Three Crosby, that you can see kind of the chaos in that space and everything that we were trying to do in a 1,800 square foot overall space with a wet floor that's, I don't know, it could have been 150 square foot wet floor to do paper production, to host classes, to work with artists, and to do custom paper production. It was, you know, it was really something to have that all work out in that space. So I can speak to, I don't know if the next slide has to do with the panel process, but
with Nancy's work, for anyone who doesn't know, this is Paul Wong on the left.
Oh, pardon me.
That's right. Artistic Director Emeritus of Dieu Donné, and Sue Gosson on the right, the founder. And then, so as you were saying, part of the process, the selection process, is looking at an artist's work and trying to figure out what direction they would go in during this residency program, and how they would experiment with pulp and how their work would translate into paper. And these pieces were part of Nancy's selection process, or part of the selection, for the residency.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to see this. It's great to, I mean, Nancy and I have been friends for a very long time, and it's just great to be able to look back at this work and to think about it. And Nancy, you even forgot, right, that you'd actually submitted these slides for the for the selection process. But I do remember when this came, you know, this is slides, you know, we would get 10 slides from each artist and a little statement written up, and feed the slide carousels and project them over, we'd have, like, you know, soup and wine panel discussions in the evenings. And I remember when this work came up, and we just thought, like, here's someone who really has a facility with a lot of different unusual materials, and stays very fluid with also really hard materials, but everything feels very kind of plastic and malleable. And we thought, this is someone who could really work with pulp and have it function well and play well with a lot of the other materials that you incorporate in your work. We didn't think that you were going to make pieces that would just sit outside in plein air, but later on we'll be talking about some other work that kind of went there. But yeah, so it's, I think the next slide, you sort of get a sense of some of the first works that Nancy did during her residency, and some of the similar forms, and working with pulp as a skin to cover the forms. And you know, I'd love to, Nancy, if you remember any of your first impressions about how you felt about working with this material.
You know, it was really, I don't remember so much, but it was mostly experimentation. What I do remember was connecting right away to the material and feeling like it felt like it was entirely new, but also felt very familiar because my original background as an undergraduate had been in ceramics. And so when Paul made me these sheets of paper, it felt like a slab of clay. And when there was this kind of bucket of pulp, it felt like slip. So I felt like I kind of knew how to use the material without ever being shown how to use the material, but I really didn't know anything about it, and it was all new. And I don't even really remember how it was a long time ago, how I came to make these things at that time. I mean, I can see the connection when you reminded me of the installation in the park, that those pieces in the park were based on different kinds of ideas of shelters in nature, and these have a kind of pod or shell kind of form, which relates to what those oversized forms were.
Yeah, and I like the description of the way you're using pulp here as a kind of skin. And I know that in your work, you're interested in the idea of transparency, which also functions as a kind of membrane. And I can go through some of the other images here.
Yeah, I've always been interested in this kind of walking the line between the body and making work relating to the body and making work related to nature. And when you're talking about skin and membrane, that connects to that.
Yeah, and I think, transparency also sort of blurs the division between the dichotomy of the inside and the outside, and the external, internal, functional, non-functional. So you were sort of experimenting with paper. Did you want to talk a little bit about this piece?
Well, I mean, just in general, what I remember, I was thinking about this morning, was how incredibly precious the material felt, which is like such a different way than it feels now. Because I remember like Paul would make me a sheet of paper, and I'd be like, if there was a little tiny bit, like if I had scraps of that colored pulp that was covering the parts in relief, I remember asking, can I take home what's left, Paul? And it was like a little quarter of a piece of wet cotton of a certain color, and it wrapped up, so it was just this like magical, unfamiliar something that, had so many qualities that I loved, but sort of didn't, it had this sort of flexibility and transparency and malleability of clay, which I had, had been like my first material when I was a young artist, but it didn't have the weight and had things that I had kind of had more than enough of at that point. So it was almost like magic. And I remember like taking home, I can think about it now, taking home these little packages of like half a piece of something, how special it felt. And, and I feel like looking back at these images that you pulled out, Rael, I can see that also at that point there was already a relationship between kind of sculpture and drawing in these pieces, which have sort of been the way my work has moved, like the whole and then the drawing of the whole, or, that kind of back and forth between presence and absence and what leads you from one thing to the next. I think those have been ideas the whole time, and I can see that here.
Yeah.
And I was also, like as you mentioned, very interested in translucency and transparency, and the fact that I could make a form that you could also see through, but could also become a skin on another material, because the element on the right, is a sheathed form over a wire armature, but then it's over a piece of wood, and then the wood is bleeding through. So the way the material could relate to so many kinds of understructures was exciting and kind of magical to me too.
Yeah, and I feel like the titles of these pieces sort of go along with that idea of the connection between body and nature. Titles like echo and ripe, sown, trace, they have these different connotations depending on the context, and reflect elements of the body and nature, but also medical sciences and technology. So this is a page from a catalog from 1995, which looked back at 5 years of the Workspace program. And there's an introductory text by you, Mina. And as you mentioned before, in 1992, Dieu Donné started accepting exclusively emerging artists to the Workspace program, and I'm sure that helped Nancy form this long-term bond with the organization as she continued to work in paper and collaborate with Dieu Donné and go back to that space in her work. And then after her residency ended in 1993, Nancy, you continued to work with Dieu Donné, and they moved from Crosby Street to Broome Street in 1994. And in that space, you worked on these pieces, on this gorgeous installation at the Botanical Gardens in Staten Island. I was wondering if you could tell us about that.
Sure. I get a couple of things come to mind. When I finished the Workspace residency, there was, I remember this pretty clearly, although Mina said she doesn't remember, but there was an evaluation form. And I remember saying on the evaluation form, I feel like I just got started and I would love to, you know, be able to do more. And I don't even remember meeting you, Mina, during the residency. I remember you as this disembodied voice speaking from the balcony, you know, but you got in touch and then we started to talk about what I could do. And at that time I was really interested in gardens, and somehow the idea came up to try and do something in a greenhouse. And, you know, we explored some possible greenhouses and then came upon this one. So the first thing that we did was we had to find some place that was had an interest in art, but was not such a formal place that they weren't going to let us, you know, kind of stick stuff in their greenhouse, basically. So the first thing was to test paper that would hold up to moisture, because in greenhouses, things get watered. So we did some tests, and Abaca turned out to hold up awfully well, but I made the paper at Dieu Donné, but I didn't make the work at Dieu Donné because it was too big. And so I made armatures in my studio, made the paper in Dieu Donné, and then my memory is brought the paper back to the studio, still wet, and some interns at Dieu Donné would come out to my studio and help me with some of it. So the front room of the Botanical Gardens, which is on the left side as I'm seeing it, was a formal garden, and there were these very large pieces kind of hovering over this pond. Part of the armature were vines that had been culled from the gardens by the horticulturalists, and the room on the right was the propagation room, which was normally closed to the public, which was where they grew things to plant outside, but for this installation they allowed it to be open. And all of the armatures here on the right side were made of garden implements and kind of strung together with garden hoses. And over the 6 months or so that it was there, you can start to see it happen. Vines started to grow over the hoses, kind of connecting the work.
I remember, Nancy, wasn't this up for like close to a year, right?
Yeah, I think it was a year, because I remember also it changed in the summer. Like in the winter, the windows were clear, and in the summer they painted them white. It got watered, it got rained on.
So the piece started to integrate itself into the environment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and all the vines were like climbing around the hoses.
Yeah, it got much crazier. And in this image on the left, the big image, it's when, so I think the other one was when the windows were painted white because the sun was too strong, the form was more opaque, and when there was more light coming in, it became more translucent.
So Nancy, I have a little surprise for you. Can you all see that?
That's great, Mina.
And it hasn't changed at all. I mean, I remember when you gave it to me and I had it hanging above my desk all those years, and then, you know, packed it away, and then, you know, we went on the farm, and I just, you know, we still are in boxes since we made the second move. Great. But I just pulled it out this morning.
That's amazing. That's great.
but it really has not changed. And actually, I just wanted to take a second to mention that Tatiana Ginsburg, who is at Dieu Donné Paper Mill, she wrote this great article for Hand Paper Making magazine in 2008, looking at paper art and public installations. And she did a whole section. I think she must have interviewed you, Nancy, for that piece. And you had talked about how you worked with wax in order to kind of permeate the paper so that it would be more aqueous, sort of, it would be kind of sized to the elements. And then you also talked about doing indoor installations and having to use fire retardants that you had sort of mixed results with. And anyway, that was a really great article, and maybe would be of interest to some of the sculptors and artists in on this call. But I can throw that into the chat later if people are interested in that. Yeah, but this was a great, this was, and I remember that Frederica Jarko at the Greenwall Foundation was really taken with this project and helped to make this possible. And then that was also the year that we had everybody coming to New York for the Friends of Dart Hunter conference. And I do remember you having to take a group of people onto the ferry and over to the Staten to Snug Harbor to visit the installation. So that was really, I think one of the in terms of helping an artist realize a project of that scale. That was something that I was really most proud of in my tenure at Dieu Donné.
And it opened up, I did many more kind of large scale paper installations after that. And, having figured out how to transport wet paper, you work on, there was a lot of a learning curve, and then I was kind of able to use it in lots of different ways down the road. I remember when I first covered this, we made all the paper, I made the armature with this big form, covered it with paper, left a seam that was kind of the amount that worked on a smaller piece of paper, and came in the next day and the entire thing had kind of like ripped apart, like the shrinkage on the scale. So there were so many things to learn about like drying, just like, it's different every time. So
yeah.
So these pieces were, I think, before the greenhouse.
Somewhere in that time period, I was also working with Abaca as a skin on sculptures that were made of other materials, kind of as a skin and kind of a body. And I was, especially at that time, just like loved the translucency and the kind of bone quality that Abaca had, and was used to working with lots of different materials, and the way that it kind of created this kind of harmonizing between them was really interesting to me. Yeah. And these pieces were playing a lot with weight and gravity. The piece on the left was suspended and held up by a heavy little weight on the opposing side. And the one on the right had this, kind of giant meandering lobby shape. So the paper was kind of, amazingly versatile for me to, kind of explore lots of different ideas.
Yeah, it's interesting looking at these pieces in relation to the botanical garden pieces, because these sort of look like evolved versions. They're like further down the evolutionary chain than the pieces that you made during the residency. They've started to sort of grow limbs, and they're expanding. And this also falls into that category, Tussle from 1997. And this is part of your a series you did called Paper Skins.
Right, the idea of skin, as we're talking about, and I think this also connects in a way to that very first work. Not looking back at it, but this felt very kind of figurative to me, and I was playing with using the paper in different ways, like a skin on the outside, but on some of those flax forms on the left or flax mixed with abaca. The skin is kind of inside and wrinkling, and you can't really tell, but the larger form that looks open also had paper on it that gets burned away. So there was this kind of edge of skin that was removed. So a kind of inviting but sort of dangerous back and forth for me. And this was in the traveling show of some anniversary of Dieu Donné, 20. I don't know.
The rags to riches. Yeah, 25 years.
25
Yeah.
of Dieu Donné in general. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a fun work to build a box for.
It looks like it wants to break out of any box that you would.
Yeah, it came in parts, but it's still, I think it was in more than one like large, careful box. It's true.
So yeah, jumping forward a little bit, I wanted to cycle back to the theme of nature in your work. And we see it really clearly in the botanical garden pieces, but you've also collaborated with a number of other organizations that have a more scientific and environmental focus.
So these drawings followed a sculpture. Do you want to go to the sculpture first and then jump back? I did a collaboration in Princeton with, it was part of a project where scientists, landscape architects, and sculptors collaborated together on pieces that were sort of in response to particular pieces of research. So the sculpture was based on research on how mice perceive smell, and how when a certain smell is received, the neurons kind of fire up in certain ways and sort themselves within the brain of the mouse. So this piece was meant as a very abstract take on the idea of, on the back of the piece, the kind of, I'm forgetting what it's called, but the part of the brain that receives the smell, where everything is organized, and then then when a certain taste is received, then the neurons kind of shoot out, fire up, and respond in a different way in the first thing. So the piece had these electroluminescent wires that were lit all the time, but really you didn't see it until the dark, and there was a computer program, so it simulated so that it seemed like different things were firing at different times. So you'd see just the red light up or just the yellow light up, and then you'd see them all light up. So the two drawings that Rael just showed and this one here were made maybe during the process or after, but about that kind of the transmission of information. You know, so using kozo and little bits of pulp on abaca, you know, to sort of kind of catch a two-dimensional understanding of that process. And I've gone back and forth a lot over the years between making a sculpture or making an installation and then doing drawings in handmade paper, on handmade paper, in some way that kind of catch some element of that experience.
And I like how you created two works to show the daytime and nighttime and how that changes the appearance of the piece. And I feel like our synapses fire differently depending on if it's daytime.
Yeah, it was so fun to work with scientists who had that much at their disposal too, because I'm used to scrambling a lot.
Scrounging.
And these people had like, I mean, I think the Defense Department paid for those wires. It was, you know, something like that. So it was a very different experience. It was still scrambling, but not like normal scrambling.
So that takes us to this piece, Estuary, which also makes references to nature. Could you talk about the inspiration behind this piece?
Sure. This piece is, and this is actually just part of the piece. This is 30 feet long and it continues like another 30 feet on the floor. But it was in response to a river in the Pine Barrens of southern New Jersey, the Mullica River. And it was part of an exhibition at a beautiful museum down there called the Noise Museum. And the curator there had invited me to make a piece in response somehow to the environment. And I was, have been thinking about rivers for a long time. This was the first big piece about a river, but one of the interesting things about the river is the color changes as it moves from kind of an area where cedar trees leach into the water as it moves toward the ocean. So there's a color change in the water, and the kind of overall composition follows some satellite photographs of the map of the river. So the piece is made of abaca, and one of my ideas was, because the water is always changing color, I wanted to work with the color that sort of, so I made an armature out of wire that was covered in paper. And then there's pieces of that armature that are covered and pieces open. And I wanted to play with kind of bits of the color going all the way. So it isn't a straight transition, but a transformation as it actually happens in nature to some degree. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And this is like the most color. When I made this piece, I had never done anything in paper, even remotely like this. It was kind of astonishing.
I think one thing to note here, Nancy, is, you always talk about light, how paper itself carries that translucency, but is also a carrier of color, because these aren't painted.
Right.
These are sheets that are made with the pigmentation in the pulp, and then I think you probably combine. You had a whole palette that you would combine down, but right. I think so it's
No, you go ahead.
No, I'm just noting with that piece, I hadn't really thought about just as a carrier of color. And then plus, I think if you're viewing it, you would be able to see through and in between the waves themselves as like planes of light.
I agree. I also wanted to say now that, like, over the years at Dieu Donné, I learned so much from working with the different paper makers, and kind of their kind of creativity and problem solving. And when I wanted to do this, it was Rachel Gladfelter, who was working at the time, who had this idea of sort of two buckets of pulp on opposite ends of the spectrum and kind of constantly mixing them together along the way. So,
well, just like as just an aside about the name of the program, the Workspace Program, there we are emphasizing the physical plant, the equipment and the wet floor and the studio, this workspace, and then the residency, meaning, a dedicated time that an artist has in that space. And I think, as you just mentioned, one of the main things about the residency is the collaborator, is the interaction with the skilled collaborator, the skilled staff, to really kind of jumpstart the work. So you're not just starting with a bucket of white pulp and wondering what you're going to do with it. So I think that's kind of might be interesting to think about a slight name change of the program to really emphasize it.
Looking at this, is there were in the marshes around this river, there were all these grasses growing. Salt hay, I think it was called, and I had read that there had been a paper making industry in that part of New Jersey in like the 15 or 1600s. And so my first idea was to like make all the paper for this piece, and we harvested those grasses, and it just like, it was like, cardboard or straw. So that that didn't go anywhere, but there are bits and pieces of those fibers in this paper that you can't see until you're up close, but they're mixed in there. This view is a little bit of how it starts to go onto the floor.
Yeah. And speaking of the experimental nature of the program and the collaboration, there are a number of techniques that you've picked up over the years that sort of result from the collaborative nature of the program itself and just working with different paper makers, as you said. And this is one of the pieces where you were sort of toying with new techniques in your process.
So what happened here is, you know, I've had the opportunity at different times to get different kinds of funding from outside places to make some of this work at Dieu Donné, and I got a grant where I was teaching, and Amy Jacobs came out to my studio and we sort of chatted about what I might want to do, and I was making a lot of sculpture with rubber, which I had really gravitated to because it had, you know, because it was translucent and it wasn't fragile. Well, it turns out it doesn't necessarily last forever, but it worked for a while. And Amy said, well, maybe you can put some of these rubber things in the drawings. And it was sort of that like launched another direction. So sometimes just a conversation can, you know, really set things going. So this was a series of pieces where I made the rubber shapes, rubber and wire elements in the studio, brought them to Dieu Donné, and then sandwiched them between different pieces of paper, which some of which I painted on top of and some of which I didn't. But then this kind of, I had embedded wire in paper many times before, but the sort of the rubber shapes that had a dimension that was still flexible, that it could go through the press and other things without it being problematic, that was a new thing. So
Nancy, the red one and the lower right?
I think that's not a piece of paper. I think that's just a pile of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what, I mean, I did make some like kind of dark reddish brown ones, but I think that's just a pile of them, you know, looking back.
Did these then, did they stay relative, like relief works, or did they move into?
Like the one on the left. They're in the piece, and then sometimes I peeled a little bit of the pulp off so you could see them, and sometimes they're just in relief.
Mm-hmm.
And then you continued that sort of, or a similar process in the Hackensack series, right?
Yeah, I mean, in this installation, I was, do you want to go to do you mind going to the landscape, actual landscape first? So since after that first piece on the Mullica River, I've done a whole bunch of pieces based on different rivers, not entirely around New York and New Jersey, but largely around New York and New Jersey. And this is a site called Mill Creek Marsh, outside of Secaucus, New Jersey. And it's a crazy place that had been a forest in the 1500s and became a freshwater marsh and then a saltwater marsh, and these old cedar trees that were remnants of a forest that was, there's different stories about what happened to the forest, but in any case, the tree stumps remained and are still there, and in low tide, you can see them. And it's a crazy place because you can see the Empire State Building in one direction and oil refineries in another, and, you know, Walmart, and it's like so New Jersey. And then there's this like weird piece of nature, weird, like one of the strangest things I've ever seen, kind of hidden off the highway. So I kept visiting this site and taking pictures of it. And my first thought was not to make a new installation because they're so kind of overwhelmingly exhausting as projects and take a long time, and then what happens to them and all of those things. But I was not able to capture what I wanted to about this piece in a sculpture or a drawing. So that eventually led to the installation. So if you want to go back to it, Rael, sorry.
That's right.
So this is just a piece of it. You know, this is maybe a third of the installation, but it's a combination of drawings in handmade paper, some with rubber embedded, as the earlier pieces had been, some just drawn on, some sculptural elements made of wire and covered in paper, some made of glass, a few made of rubber. And then kind of, so the paper is on the wall, on the floor, suspended from the ceiling, the paper and the glass. And the glass was kind of, was more evocative to me of the ice, and the paper, you know, these kind of this paper forms on the floor of the tree stumps, and then everything else kind of just the general environment. And then at one point, as a kind of effort to kind of pull it all together, I just started pouring the actual pulp that I was making the paper of on the floor. I had a cement floor and just started sort of I thought, well, pulp can be, I kept trying other things on the floor, like tar paper and rubber and stuff. And then I thought, well, you can put pulp on the floor. It's on the floor all the time at Dieu Donné. We're always cleaning it up. So I took the pulp and I like poured it on the floor and started like swirling it around. And it's like, whoa. And then, so anyway, so that was kind of exciting to use what would normally be a mess as a way to kind of hold the piece together. And I was grateful, like the piece was shown in a number of different venues, and I was grateful at first to Midori Yoshimoto at NJCU in Jersey City for allowing me to pour this pulp all over her floor. And, you know, and then once someone let me do it, I was kind of able to convince another series of people again and again to allow me to do some version of it, so.
Did the configuration of the installation change from venue to venue?
Yes, because the spaces were very different. So I first made it in my studio where it just had two very long walls. And then later in the presentation, you'll see a drawing that came once at that gallery. It had another wall, and then it went to 3 other places. And the last one, so this drawing on the right was made I hadn't made it in the studio, but then I made it for the exhibition space at New Jersey City University, because there was an extra wall as a way to kind of continue the installation. And then in its last venue at Urban Glass, the place was just absolutely enormous. And so then I made like a 15-foot long drawing. I mean, it was just like, it kept growing and adapting as the space changed.
That seems like another recurring theme in your work, that the works sort of evolve over time and they change and grow.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one kept growing to kind of adapt to the space. It was exciting to, you know, kind of take this and keep stretching it. That was very exciting.
Oh. Sorry. Spoiler alert. Let's go back to, sorry, my slides are all messed up now. Okay. So going from the ice on the river here, I know that you also, not to get off the topic of paper, but you also work a lot with glass, and the way you've described it sounds like a very similar process for you.
I started working in glass, experimenting with the material not that many years after I started experimenting with paper, and although it does have the problem of heaviness and fragility that I was so excited the paper didn't, it does share a lot of qualities to me of translucency and its ability to take many forms, and the way that they both transform in the process of working with them. And then they just seem to me like I've made a lot of work using the two of them together. I guess the way they both, you know, when you're talking about transmitting color and light, glass does both also. And so I think that was interesting to me. So I continued to work with both of these materials in addition to other materials, but you know, for probably the last 20 years, they've both been pretty steady along with other things that come and go.
And then continuing the discussion of experimentation, do you want to talk about what it is that you're doing here and how?
Sure. In some of the drawings you'll see, I had become quite interested in mangrove forests and spent some time kayaking through them on a couple of different occasions, and was trying to figure out about translating that experience into some drawings, and had brought in some rope to Dieu Donné as a way to sort of kind of almost like draw in rope the images of the mangroves to do a blowout. But and I did do that, and you'll see that. But while I was there, Tatiana suggested playing with just pouring the pulp directly on the ropes and then taking the ropes away and see what happens. So that was that led to some other experimentation and some new work that I've been playing with. So the ropes, so I have a sheet of wet paper I've made. I put the ropes down, I pour the pulp, and then after a while take the ropes away, and there's an impression from the rope, but there's also this sort of interesting bleeding of whatever it is that, I don't know, that makes the rope brown, starts to kind of seep into the paper. So there's this kind of a little bit of brown and orange in there, which I really loved. So it was another example of, you know, a sort of casual comment, like launching a new direction, which was pretty exciting, that I'm still playing with. So here's laying down the ropes for the blowout. And then down below, you can see the ropes are starting to get brown from like sitting in buckets all day, because after like it's got pulp on it, I take it and throw it in a bucket, but then the rope itself is starting to create, you know, it's starting to weather, I suppose. And then those colors are staining the paper. I guess that's what they're doing, Mina, right? They're staining it.
I don't know what that brown is.
It hasn't gone away yet. So this is one of the mangrove blowout pulp pieces that we made at that time, and one done in a more refined manner and one kind of letting it be looser. And I'm interested in that contrast too, actually, even almost going back to the greenhouse, where it's about kind of the you know, the presentation and the process, like the formal and the growth. This has that to me.
Yeah. And there's this lovely picture.
I guess this is when we pulled the ropes away and we're seeing what happened.
Yeah. So this is for another project.
Yeah, this was doing some blowouts based. So actually, this preceded the other pieces. This is a little bit before, but I was continuing to be interested in water. I was also very interested in the reflections that you see on the surface of water and kind of the crazy patterns that you can see like on a still body of water on a lake when it's really sunny and everything is reflecting and there's this crazy color and you almost can't see anything but the movement of the color and the pattern across the water. So I made some stencils, which were super time consuming to make, but that we did the blowouts from. And the rope in the preceding drawing was a way to see, can I kind of get something I want to do without like spending days cutting a stencil? But you know, they're both working. So this was making the blowouts with Amy and an assistant that they had.
Yeah.
Whose name I don't.
Yeah,
What?
Just looking at the stencil, it looks so intricate.
Yeah, and yeah, they were really complicated.
Yeah, and what are you doing with in the middle picture there?
Well, so when you blow out, when you get rid of the pulp with the hose, there's a choice on how much of what's left, like the residue you want or don't want. And in the blue drawing before, one has like no residue left and the other has lots of residue. So this is picking out extra stuff that doesn't blow away with the hose, because you don't want to take too much away because then you'll have nothing. So walking that line between what stays and what goes.
Just wanted to interject really quick. We have a couple more minutes to finish up the presentation and then we should transition into questions.
Okay. And this is the completed work.
Right.
So
so what you saw before is underneath a section of the lower right-hand corner. So this, once I did the big Hackensack Dreaming installation and made the one drawing for that, it kind of launched a new direction in my work that has been very exciting for me personally. And these are, you know, some of many more very large scale pieces of handmade paper. So the piece that we were just making is a section of the lower right-hand corner. So it's a bunch of those blowouts put together. And then I used the stencils again in my own studio to kind of work with pulp directly, not sheets of paper, but pulp directly on top of the kind of combined elements of the piece. And then removing some and putting abaca in behind it to sort of like create some light and translucency in there.
And this is a picture of us on the right in August, I think.
Yeah.
Just to give everyone a sense of the scale of these pieces. So you were working in a much larger, on a much larger scale. which started earlier than this. But, and just another example of the scale. This is Cherryscape from 2015. So you also make these tapestry pieces like the drawing that we saw from Hackensack, this one here. And yeah, I'm also, well, I'm interested in how you refer to these as drawings, even though they combine so many different elements. But I'm also interested in, I feel like there's another layer, another connection between nature and the body and how you address themes of physical fragility and impermanence in your work.
So I call them drawings because I'm not really sure what else to call them, but so anyway, but I'm interested in paper and actually in glass because they're resilient, they're flexible, they're translucent, but they're also really fragile. And I'm really interested in the idea of pushing fragility as a material. And it makes sense to me that the idea of the work and the materials that they're made in, like, have a relationship to each other. So the work that relates to nature also relates to the fragile aspects of nature, the waterways that are in danger, the kind of environmental issues, the way nature is kind of under stress and adapts. And then, you know, at the same time, over the decades, not so much about my own aging, but being very involved with the aging of my now parents who are in their 90s, and the kind of, you know, and illness and death of people I know, the body and ways of carrying and holding and protecting or not protecting the body have also been big parts of my work. And I did do some large scale pieces in paper about those kind of conveyances for the body, but also in glass. And I did a very large glass piece, kind of a little smaller than life size, of a glass wheelchair. And this drawing references that, the wheelchair, and then the kind of body barely balancing and the kind of sadness and fragility of life in that way. To me, they're not very different. You know, I used to think I have these two bodies of work that are parallel. You know, one's about the body and one's about nature. And like, the longer it goes on, the more I feel like they're the same thing. And especially now in this pandemic, they're clearly the same thing, right? So.
Yeah, I like a phrase you used, conveyances for the body. And I think that also relates to care networks, like the one that you illustrate here, which was inspired by being a caregiver for your parents, but also just going back to your residency, you were conveying another body at that time.
Yeah.
Becoming a mother, which I don't want to.
Right.
Yeah,
it's true.
I don't want to.
Yeah.
Like, women artists have an unfair.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to go too much into that, but yeah. It is another connection to sort of internal, external forms in your work, and vessels that carry things either for protection or just as natural occurrences.
I think you're right.
And then I'll just quickly go through these. And you see some similar motifs from the sculptures that you made during your residency and the drawings, especially in this little figure here. And how you come back to these sort of skeletal shapes. And then this is a more recent work, a COVID era piece, which, if you want to talk more about that.
Sure. I mean, I think this one is very much an integration of landscape and the body. And I guess my kind of, you know, in working with paper and kind of learning new things and figuring out new things, it's an exciting thing to me, because there's like, I'm still discovering things, which, you know, after, you know, almost 30 years, it's kind of exciting to still have that experience. But one, you know, a part to me that was really exciting about this piece is some of the poured linen drawings that I did, like that when with the ropes, I was just like playing around, also just pouring the linen, and I realized if I turned them upside down, like the back of them, they kind of started to look like x-rays, you know. So these elements, I mean, it was sort of a discovery, not a plan. So the elements kind of in the upper left and bottom right is the back of what I was making. And it has this kind of translucency of like an image there and not there. And actually, if you see this drawing up close, there's other places where there's that idea of some image like from behind coming through, which was exciting to me. So this one also has something like I haven't done before. And I think I have learned a lot over the years at working at Dieu Donné and watching other people work, and some of it's just sort of filed away, and you know, and then every once in a while it's like, oh, what happened if I try this, you know? And so that's been a really exciting thing to sort of like have it like all stashed away in a disorganized Rolodex in my brain. So
a lot of the questions that we have in the Q&A lean a little bit more towards comments. Nancy, there's a lot of compliments towards your work. Many of the pieces that you've shown have been getting compliments along the way.
thanks.
So I'm gonna pose these questions anonymously. Someone says, wow, I'm totally blown away by how large your sculptures were then, talking about the era of when you were working in the greenhouse, and a little bit after that. Are you still keeping these older sculptures in storage? What are you doing with them now? It's so nice to finally meet Mina and learn about your shared history.
I was laughing, so I lost the second half of what you said. I'm sorry. Well, after you said about storage, sorry.
Oh, yeah. Are they in storage? Are they moving around? Do they have a life now? And also, it's so nice to finally virtually see Mina and learn about your shared history.
Yeah. So this piece does have another life because it's on CW Post Campus on Long Island University. But the greenhouse piece, the only thing left of that is in Mina's bedroom. I mean, I thought about keeping that because in a year in the greenhouse, it was not destroyed. You know, it like survived everything. It was kind of unbelievable. But what was I going to do with it, you know? So I didn't save this. I did some of the, and it was sad, but you know, that was the idea to begin with. And then some of the other large, I did do some permanent paper installations that have had their share of issues with fire marshals and things like that. The estuary piece did have a long life. It went to a number of interesting venues. And then for some years was like reconfigured and was in the Health Sciences Library, in the entry of the Health Sciences Library at Howard University, but has now just like, it was an entirely glass area and it lasted a long time, but the color is going. So I don't think it'll be there too much longer. The Hackensack Dreaming piece, I showed in a number of places, and I did save that because that broke down, you know, into boxes versus, you know, the estuary piece. I mean, it's a lot of boxes, like 30 boxes or something, because this is just a piece of it. But the estuary piece, you know, took like a third of my studio. It didn't, you know, the armature did not break down. So you can't save everything unless you have more resources than I had. So.
Someone else just commented saying, I'm so impressed. Nancy, you make sculpture painterly and lines so sculptural. Someone wanted to know a little bit more about your process of creating your large drawings. So you talked a little bit about the blowouts, how the paper is made. Could you talk about after the paper making process? Like,
sure. I mean, and they don't all have blowouts, not at all. So I make the paper at Dieu Donné. I bring it home. I make the pigment, the color is in the paper. When I pigment the paper as I'm making it in the vat. Sometimes I'll do some pouring of other colors like right before I pull the sheet. So there's some kind of natural changing of color. And then I bring the wet sheets back to the studio, you know, kind of the process we devised over the greenhouse, which has been working all these years. I keep it refrigerated in plastic. And then to make the large sheets, I put the smaller sheets wet on the floor, join them together with methyl cellulose, dry them under weight. And then when they're dry, hang them on the wall. And in the very last one, you can see that in that Blue Storm one, Rael, you can see that there's like magnets all around the edge. That's because this was like photographed when it was just being finished in the studio. And so to work on them, I make the big part, the ground, first, and then I do everything else vertically, wet on dry. And because I'm working wet on dry, it's a constantly shrinking and expanding kind of surface. So it doesn't tear. I have like my walls covered in thumbtacks and the drawings covered in magnets. And so then it kind of stretches. And then I work with wet pulp and wet sheets of paper on top. And all different fibers of pulp in the drawing part, in the what's going on top.
Okay. And then there's a question about how the trowel was made in...
It's a trowel. It's a trowel.
It's a real trowel with like the little green things that they use to sort of sometimes water stuff, little green plastic, and it's just covered.
I always thought those were like when you're getting flowers at the florist and they to kind of prolong their life.
They had them also. They had them also in the propagation room with something like for holding moisture or something.
Okay.
May I ask a question?
Of course.
So I just wanted to go back to the tapestries or the large scale drawings.
I like you call them tapestries.
I know, and I just wanted to bring up when Jordana Monk Martin wrote about the big works in the textile issue of hand paper making, and I know we don't really. You call them drawings, maybe they're paper works, but I just love that she kind of folded them into the history of tapestries, and I love how she called them here. Oh shoot! Now I can't find the spot. Traditional tapestry. Okay. Cohen's drawings call forth the idea of tapestries. The mural's authoritative drape and physicality maintain the heft and dignity of traditional woven tapestries, like those found insulating the walls of drafty castles. But something else that you had said about paper when you were speaking to Ming Fei for a conversation in hand paper making, you had said that paper was really about writing and drawing and thinking, and that these things happen in paper or on paper. And so I guess my question for you was, with these very large scale works, like tapestries, which have to be really, the composition has to be completely mapped out in order for the weft and the warp to all come together to form this epic tableau. Is that kind of how you approach these drawings? So I think really in that way, they really are drawings.
Yeah, they're much more intuitive. I mean, the paper is made with some ideas in mind, and there is a kind of compositional idea or memory of a place or to start them, but then there's so much going on in response to what happens. So it's both. They're not starting from nothing, but they really evolve.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I thought you were going to say that I remember Jordana saying was that the kind of, if the paper tears when I'm working on these, I don't actually care at all. And then I take another piece, even if it's not the same, and kind of add it on. And so the patching becomes part of the story. And she talked about that in the history of tapestry. And I thought that was pretty interesting, because to me, the work is about the process of making it too. Mm-hmm. And so I'm interested in like the changes that happen to the material while I'm working on it. That kind of back and forth of like having control and not having control and knowing and not knowing is really interesting to me.
Someone else commented asking for the article that you were referencing, Mina, Tatiana had written.
Yeah.
That to be shared, and I can do that via email with all the participants afterwards.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And then final note, we have a lot more comments just mentioning how great the lecture was, how beautiful the work is, inspiring and thought-provoking works. Thank you for sharing the process, a fascinating dialogue between 2 and 3 dimensions. So gorgeous, so good to hear about your love of the materials. What I like best is that is how your work comes together is rather mysterious and magical. And I feel privileged to have seen quite a few of your installations over the years, including the one in 1992. Yeah, so lots of fans. Thank you all for participating in the talk. And thank you all for coming to this talk. Yeah, it was really enjoyable. Thank you so much, everyone. Okay, see you soon.